Good morning,
Um,
good afternoon,
yeah, evening, I
good
guess for
evening.
some. Very early for you. Today we're unusual time, 5 a.m. for Jason. So if he falls asleep, we will not blame him. Um,
Yep.
I love this how simultaneous head turning. This is great. We can maybe do dance. When when we can't do the podcast anymore. So slightly unusual time. This is because our guest today, and we'll introduce her in a second, is based in Southeast Asia. So as always, we kind of try to navigate time differences. But everybody, welcome to season 11, episode 3 of Disasters Deconstructed. So 3 episodes in, the third episode today. And in this season, we are talking about politics of disasters. This is kind of the original question, so to say, the question that we've been trying to discuss and unpack, I think, through all the previous seasons, and this season we're really kind of focusing on this. What does politics mean in disasters? How do we repoliticize disasters, and why don't we do it yet?
Yes, so I'm excited to continue this season today with episode 3 with Dr. Maria Carinas Alejandra Gonzalez. Karen is an assistant professor at the University Brunei Darussalam, and she's an anthropologist specializing in disaster governance and health inequalities in Southeast Asia. It's really our privilege to welcome Karen to Disasters Deconstructed to talk about politics of reconstruction in the Philippines. And welcome, Karen.
Hi, good evening from Brunei.
Good.
Welcome. It's Thank you so much for joining us. We talked about this last year when you were, of course, in the UK here with me. So I'm glad you're finally on Disasters Deconstructed. All right. Well, let's go straight into questioning you. And as you probably know, this season we start with asking all of our guests the same question, and there will be the last question is also the same, but the question is kind of similar and simple. What is disaster for you?
Um, it's interesting that you mentioned that it's simple, but it's never really simple. At least from the places that I've been doing some work on this, I've always seen that disaster is inherently and deeply political, and so. Most of the time, I engage with people from government and other institutions, and they define it as a matter of natural hazard occurring and can't be saved, acts of God, and such things. But all the time, we miss the whole idea that disasters are often systemic, and these are the systems that leave some people behind to experience what others are not experiencing. And for example, one thing that I always try to remember is that of my positionality. For example, I work with a lot of urban poor communities in Southeast Asia, mostly in the Philippines, and they would experience disaster on a daily basis. Some of them have been born into places that were in hazard is a continuous daily experience. And then I go home to my home that is safe, that is gated, and so that actually creates like a cognitive dissonance in me. Like I was just in a flood stricken area. I mean, they're surviving there, and then I go home to my gated community wherein flooding has never happened ever, and that's why it was sold to us that flood free forever. So yeah, so flooding for me is never really a non-political context. So is disasters. Yeah.
This is amazing, and we will, of course, unpack this further. But what you're talking about is, I guess, something that many of us, particularly in the global north, or the scholars who are based in more privileged institutions, right? We can relate to that, and I think that's why kind of thinking about this positionality is really important, and maybe part of this political act of how we actually understand disasters.
Yeah, I agree. All the time, positionality takes place in every type of inquiry that I make in relation to disasters, whether it's in the context of flooding or the nexus of flooding and let's say COVID or any other zoonotic disease. I always look into like who are actually experiencing this disaster, and what are the reasons that made them so inherently impacted by this, despite all the struggles that they make their lives safer. Why do they still experience this? So yeah, positionality definitely plays a role in having a more critical look into these things.
Thanks, Karen. So I want to ask some more about the Philippines. We often talk about the Philippines as like almost a poster child for DRR, especially community-based DRR. And but on the podcast, we've talked a lot of times with comrades in the Philippines who work and live there, and we hear that things aren't always that wonderful when we talk about Reconstruction, and especially talking about politics of Reconstruction and creation of vulnerability. So just wanted to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe you could tell us a bit about what do you think we're really reconstructing or reproducing?
Right. First of all, I'd like to send my solidarity to my fellow Filipinos in southern Philippines who have just experienced and are still surviving the impact of the 7.8 earthquake. And I keep on telling my friends, because I'm based in Brunei and we never have earthquakes here. We don't have that much of flooding here. So I sometimes, as a Filipino who worked on disaster spaces in the Philippines, I have like survivor's guilt that, wow, I'm just seeing this now online. I'm not there anymore, you know? And so, but yeah, going now to your question about Reconstruction. The question I think that begs to be answered would be Reconstruction by whom and for whom? In the Philippine context, I believe that most of the time Reconstruction is often a matter of restoring the status quo. I've seen this happen so many times wherein a hazard impacted a particular, let's say, infrastructure, just for an easier analysis, impacted an infrastructure, and what let's say government authorities and other actors would do is to build that same infrastructure the way that it was, and so it just continues that type of scene for a lot of impacted communities. But there is no open discussion of, do we move these people to safer grounds? Do we offer them a safer area to live in? Because the most interesting part here is that most of the people who get impacted by disasters are often in areas that are subaltern, or that are what government labels as hazard zones. And of course, the politics of blame is right there. Why are you living in these spaces? I've seen this especially in the community that I've worked in Manila, which is an urban poor community that was built by the community through reclamation processes. And so government would ask for support for drainage and city services, but during flooding, when their houses are swept away, government will not intervene to build them better housing or whatever, because the idea is that it's your fault. You lived in hazard zones. We told you not to live there. But then again, I'm sorry that I'm moving a bit off tangent here. I know you asked for Reconstruction, but I think that it's just a gamut of issues that where in Reconstruction is one part of it. Urban development definitely is another context related to this reasoning why safer infrastructures, building safer communities for affected populations is a problem. As I mentioned, in urban poor communities, the idea is to blame the community for being impacted by disaster. And so I'll not build you drainage or whatever better solution just because it's your issue, it's your problem, you're violating laws. So on a more pointed discussion on Reconstruction, I think in most cases, the idea of it's a spectrum, though it's very most of the time is so uncoordinated. The response to reconstruction, it's such a spectrum wherein fraction of the government really do learn from its from the lessons of the previous disaster. A good example for that, in Palawan province, when a typhoon, super typhoon Rai hit the province, what the government learned is that having a centralized what do you call this, humanitarian aid hub is not functional, because when the bridges are torn, you cannot cross those to deliver supplies anymore. So they learned from that. They built satellite hubs. So that is a good management, a good reconstruction context. But on the other hand, there are some organizations and some government initiatives that do not engage community knowledge, that do not share information to each other, that create the kind of fractured communication for planning of reconstruction. And if we have time, I'd talk about that community that created a relocation village that was impacted as well by another flooding.
Yeah, we would love to hear about that. And I was thinking, we see case studies, we see research coming from the Philippines that shows like very like innovative ways to engage with communities and to listen to communities. So, but I think what I'm hearing is that there's lots of stakeholders and powerful actors and institutions that aren't really listening sometimes. So there's clearly some tension between like the agenda of community-based actors and other actors, right?
Right. So going to that, for example, classic. That's a very interesting thing that I've witnessed together with my research partners. One community got severely impacted by the flooding that happened after Super Typhoon Rai in Palawan province, my hometown. So what's interesting that happened is that the government was not so quick in their response to provide shelter for the affected community. So they've been living in tents for like 6 months or so. And then a civil society organization was tapped. And the civil society organization decided to help out the community. So the organization bought a piece of land and then told the community, all right, let's build a house. We give you the supplies and everything. You build a house and that's it. So they did, without consultation with the government, without proper risk mapping or whatsoever. And so everything was set. They had a wonderful, opening of the community and everything. But the problem is that the next flooding happened. That relocation site got flooded as well. So you can just imagine the impact of that of this to the community. And so I asked the community members, did you know that this place is prone to flooding? Like the river would overflow and hit this area. They said yes. I said, why did you agree to build your houses here? And then they said, well, no one asked us to begin with. We were just told the land has been bought. Here are the supplies to make a house. You build it, you own the house. And so living in tents for 6 to 9 months and fighting your way to tell them that this place could be flooded became like a point of decision for them. Do we tell them, or we just take the house? Maybe just take the house and live another day. So community-based responses at times look like this, where it looks like the community orchestrated everything. But the thing is that most of the time, when the community does not have its own fund and are not given their right to determine for themselves, we feel like we're doing localization again. And so we need to be really critical of this context of localization. And yeah, I guess I'm going to stop with there.
I think it's fantastic, and this is really something that we don't really hear about, kind of community-based DRR in particular, right? Because it's, I think in maybe recent decade, it's almost it kind of became the silver bullet, right? That if you engage with community, all your disaster related problems will disappear. But of course, as you just said just now, what is community? Who is engaging with the community? Who is in the community? But also, what we're not addressing is vulnerability, right? Yet again, kind of going back to that kind of very very normative approach, but nevertheless this sort of the root causes, right, that help us understand what disaster is or isn't, and again, from whose perspective. And so you're giving me a really nice segue to talk a little bit more about community engagement. And earlier this year you wrote a piece for Fulcrum, which you've shared. Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed reading it. And so Fulcrum offers basically analysis of Southern Asia. And so the essay that you've written for Fulcrum is on the case of Palawan that we've mentioned a couple of times already. And you argue that the local memory is basically critical in terms of understanding how a disaster unfolds. And also, more importantly, and I guess more salient for this conversation, in terms of preparing for future disasters, right? So it's kind of the memory of the past, but also the memory of the future. So can you tell us more? What is the role of collective memory? How do we create collective memory? What does community mean, I guess, in that context of creating collective memory?
Thank you for reading the article. I really had a difficult time writing that. As most anthropologists who write about their homes I feel so conflicted writing that, because my parents still live there, my family still live there, and writing critical about home could have so many impacts. But anyway, talking about collective memory, I from the study and from various experiences, I realized that memory could actually be weaponized and instrumentalized in disasters, in periods of disasters. And in the Philippines right now, we're so divided because of the flood corruption issue that is plaguing our government. So it's as high as it can go within the government. So there's so many alleged corruptions. And so people get to be blamed. Most of the time, the discourse in politics is that, because the poor does not think, the poor is to be blamed because they keep electing these people. I would like to argue against that, actually, and say that the thing is that the reason why in some contexts people keep on getting voted into positions of power is because of the weaponization of memory, of collective memory. And to make sense of that, during periods of disaster, powerful actors will come into those disaster spaces with aid, whether it's a new boat that fisher folks can use again, whether it's food packages or new housing materials. They will come to these spaces. And most of the time, those aid will come with their faces printed on it, with their names printed on it, even if it's from public funds. So the moment that the community see it, they remember that. Of course, it will be remembered. The politician shook my hand, or whoever government agency was there. So they saved me during period of disaster. And this gets amplified in social media, in traditional media. It gets amplified. This actor came in and supported the community. Well done. But what we're not remembering, what is buried, is that some of these actors are also accountable for, let's say, the policy that made the hazard not preventable. We forget that some of these powerful actors are the very same actors who signed an ordinance that allowed for a mall to be built on top of a river that now stopped the flow of the river, which happened in Palawan, for example, allegedly. I have to say allegedly all the time. So I come from the country wherein we all get lawsuits. So anyway, so what's interesting is that when you weaponize memory in periods of disasters become a cycle. But on the opposite end as well, when you harness the memory of communities about pathways of rivers, about the strength of this type of hazard, and the level of risk that they experience, because national level of risk may not be aligned with community level of risk. So once you harness all of that information, you can actually build a stronger disaster preparedness plan that is guided by community knowledge, that is empowered by resources that are already present in the community. So it's really a double-edged sword, this memory. One can just keep you, just launch into a cycle of political violence like that, political neglect like that. The other one could actually be very supportive of community-based, community-led disaster preparedness.
So well, it's a kind of $1 million question, I guess, here. But how do we then, I guess, harness or create memory that helps us to be in solidarity, right? And to help community to kind of to stand in solidarity.
Right. And so, not promoting, but still very relevant. I think this is the reason why we need to create more creative methods for disaster research. But because one of the ways that we figured how to collect these memories, harness these memories, and help planners in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Philippines to understand the pathways of flooding in these communities is to talk to community members and ask them, how about we map your areas of risk, the real areas of risk that you experience, the areas where you find your resilience, because most of the time, traditional mapping, conventional maps provided by governments or major institutions do not account for the experiences of the community. They account for what is scientifically all established. And so, for example, one of the interesting things that we experienced, for example, in Malaysia, here in Sarawak, is that the government already put a flood what do you call this? A flood warning device. Nobody in the community knew it was a flood warning device until I pointed it to them. I said, do you know that thing? And then they said, yeah, maybe it's like a signal or something, maybe for cell phone. I was like, no, this is actually for flood. It's like a device that will warn them. And I said, why did you not know that it was there? They thought nobody explained.
Yeah.
So I asked, how do you now determine when flood is happening? So that's when we decided to do mapping, participatory mapping and photo elicitation and such things that allowed for community to develop their own map. And then we tried to provide the government with this copy, and and probably, hopefully, they make sense of it.
I mean, there's such a classic example, isn't it? I remember when I kind of just started studying disasters, and I joined the Water Engineering Development Center, and one of the people here, so they used to install water pumps, like for 50 years. And he said, if only engineers had a social scientist with them, the first water pump would have worked. And we kind of, 50 years later, we still hear the same stories that technology gets installed, that nobody cares about it. But talking about creative methods, you're so humble, and you didn't really mention that, of course, you and Kyra and Kirsten put together a really nice special issue for disaster prevention management on advancing reflective, creative, and critical research methodologies. So absolutely plug it in. Jason and I are known for promoting work that hasn't even been published yet. So absolutely, for those of you who haven't seen the special issue, please go and have a look at it.
Yeah, it's a proud moment, because we've received so many requests to actually submit their own work, and so that means there's really a clamor for a discussion for this. And I think beyond just our interest for something wonderful to do with our methodologies, because we're also trying to find ways to engage our communities, that it's not just our voices that will be heard in the way that we represent disaster and disaster studies.
That's great. So our final question, and we're asking all our guests in the season, is just like forward looking at the scholarship. How do we move things forward from an argument that academic work should be quote unquote objective and thus apolitical?
Wow. That isn't that the worst thing that we always face as scholars? Like, I'm already tired sometimes, like explaining myself why I'm very political about my take of disaster. And um, the very first thing is that if you decide not to be political about disaster, it's already your political choice. You've already decided not to participate in trying to seek for justice for communities that are impacted by any hazard that exists. And most of us scholars are already in a privileged status. We are privileged in the sense that we are most of the time detached from the actual disaster. We're just there to study the disaster. No, of course, some of us do live through the disaster, and hence the positionality things, the parts of the research. But I think at the core of disaster studies is actually justice. There is no way of separating the two. We study disaster. We study the disaster objectively, definitely. We account for what happened. We narrate what happened. But also in that narration process, we seek out who was accountable for this. We name the actors. We name the events. It's not some hazy discussion of that, yes, there was rain and hence people will have to suffer. But why do they have to suffer? And I think and this is not to be so patronizing of what you are all doing, but I actually love that there are public facing events for disaster studies. Because most of the time as academics, we're bound by the confines of our KPIs, our key performance indicators. How many did you publish? How many people cited you? Did you attend conference? Were you the keynote or not? So we measure our value like that, but I think we should go beyond that. Sure, you contribute to theories. That's great. That's great point of conversation. But then again, I always tell my students who are going to this path, I said, this is a difficult path, when you try to do disaster studies, because the moment you go through this, beyond the KPI of an academic, you are also going to be tied to the community experiencing disaster. And you cannot run away from that. At least not with a good conscience. You get promoted and then the community is still without any support, tangible support coming from you. And so we balance this objectivity and being political. And I think as an anthropologist, I'm so happy that we have a specific field for that. We call it engaged anthropology. So every time somebody asks me like, why are you so political? Because I'm an engaged anthropologist, So it becomes like, I mean, it's good that I have a home to go home to. There are people like me who understand why we have to be political with what we do. And so how do we promote this? Because when we say that we have to be political and all of this, most people think you just have to be very critical of governments or whatever. There are so many ways by which you become political. You can promote well-being of the communities that you work with by providing them spaces or giving them a chance to access spaces that you inhabit and speak for themselves, and or access grants that they usually cannot access. That's why I love. I think I want to give a shout out to a dear friend. Of course, you already know Kyra, but another dear friend of ours is Pamela Kahilig, who is also a disaster scholar. And what she does is that beyond the academic. And beyond the academic, she also engages with the community she works with. And so I remember one time she was training them how to access grants, So it's very important that we become, that we interrogate our practice here in disaster studies.
Yeah. Go on. Sorry, Jason. Go
No,
on.
I was just going to say I really appreciate that answer. And I think it made me just think about the whether we all need to reflect on our own values and whether the values matter enough to kind of infiltrate what we do. And so whatever methodology you use or whatever philosophical backing or theory you're bringing to the work, there's certain commitments to relationship and to like connection that have to be deeply rooted values. Otherwise, they're pretty easy to give up, So it's like, what is the depth of your connection with the people you work with? Is it meaningful enough to take some risk, professionally?
Yes. Professional risk is really very scary sometimes. Yes.
Yeah, and I guess kind of we can take professional risks if, again, we build a community, right? And that is very often sort of professional communities of people who share the same values. What concerns me, and this is not the first time we're raising this, is that still, so it's great to talk to anthropologists and like human geographers and sociologists, right? Because I think people who are interested in these disciplines from the get-go, they already have like this grain of critical thinking that leads them to these disciplines, right? But then, of course, very often still in disaster studies, and much of the research that we see, it is still produced by technical or science STEM disciplines, what we would call in the UK. And how do we get to those colleagues? I don't know. Still, Jason and I don't know. We had multiple conversations because we're both based in engineering kind of construction schools, where moral value, kind of ideological value, is like, are you crazy? Like, what planet are you from? My job is to build a bridge that hopefully won't collapse. It has nothing to do with values, and it's proven that as something that shouldn't be kind of objective, right? That is really, really hard, and I don't know how we're gonna tackle that issue.
It is. I think it is indeed tough. I'm not sure, but in my side of the world, I feel like fields like engineering are opening up their spaces for collaboration with us. And it, for example, in one project, I was commissioned, and I was so surprised. The first time it happened, I was so surprised. Like, really? Are you sure this is not a scam or something? They an architectural firm who is commissioned to build build something. I was asked by this architectural firm to provide social, cultural, ethical, gender, all the things that I love, analysis, talk to the community and see how they can integrate the voices of the community into the building that they're making. And I asked them, wow, is this really coming from the goodness of your heart? Of course, in a nicer version. And then they said, oh, no, this is required by the Philippine government now. So I think there's hope. We can always try to educate provide education for colleagues who might want to understand more why we have this perspective. But policy in itself can force people to consider more spaces for justice and values in this built environment.
Yeah, hopefully one day we'll see the
Yes.
shift, not in too unforeseeable future. Great, that's been great. I really like your work, and thank you so much for joining today, talking to us about Philippines and about your home place as well, which is never easy, as you said. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Really appreciate it to be able to share this to your network.
And for those of us joining us and watching us now, thank you again for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the episode as much as we did. And the next episode will be in 2 weeks' time on the 29th of June. We'll continue talking about politics and reconstruction, and it will be in our normal time, 5 p.m. UK. Jason will not need as much coffee. So thank you all for joining us. See you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks,
All
Ash.
right. Thank you.